It's nice to see so many people here. Gordon obviously has a lot of friends as well as people who are interested in our program. I just wanted to say a couple of words about restorative justice. Basically, for those of you who aren't aware of it, the police will refer cases that they feel we can handle. We're all volunteers. And we bring the perpetrators and the complainants together and try to work out some kind of an agreement that will make everybody happy and restore a good feeling, a good thing. We're a small community. We want people to be able to walk down the street, look people in the eye, and be friendly. So restorative justice restores. It's not punitive like the court system is restorative. So we thought that we might be able to use some of our skills in the community. And this is our first thrust at this. Gordon has a lot of experience as a mediator, and these are the kinds of skills that maybe we can use, because we on Salt Spring have a very bad record of debating issues. Mud gets slung, people get very excited, a little too excited, and we'd like to kind of bring that temperature down a bit so that we can discuss things in a better way. So this is our first attempt at it, and we've got a very strong person here. Gordon, as many of you know, lived on the island for 23 years and was very involved with restorative justice way back when we were a lot busier than we are today. I would just introduce Gordon.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles, and thank you all for coming to this. Holy moly. I think there's one empty chair. That may be the one Charles has to take. And we'll have to make room for other people as they arrive, if they do. And there's going to be a hurricane, somebody said. Isn't that true?
No.
Oh, no?
No, until midnight.
It passed by.
Around midnight.
Oh, good. Okay. So everybody will get home. Great. It is lovely to see so many, I was going to say old faces, so many people that I've known for a long time. And many that we don't know, and so that's fine too. Charles and others from Restorative Justice Salt Spring started giving me some messages about what it was they wanted early on, and I realized that there are really two audiences here. There are a bunch of people here who are mediators. They mediate cases for Salt Spring Restorative Justice. There are others who are, I know, in the crowd who don't do restorative justice mediation for Salt Spring, but they mediate in other contexts. So there's a bunch of people here who are mediators and are going to want to talk about the kind of problem that Charles raised from a mediator point of view. And then there's everybody else who is interested in how we deal with, how we tackle, how we regard these intractable social conflicts in the community, which keep arising, and in a way should keep arising. And we're all going to want to know more about that. And I say we all are because I am not here. I've got to dispel one myth. I'm not here with a golden bullet answer to that question. There is no one who has the answer to that question. I can say that with great authority. There's a bit's been written about it, particularly in the sort of 90s, and it's just not being followed up well. The problem being, let me just emphasize it again, how do we deal with these situations that aren't just disagreements, but are differences that are so intense that they produce disagreement, and they produce it often at an institutional level, this group versus that group, versus another group, and it can be multiple. And what do we do in the community to address that, deal with that, size it up properly? I'm avoiding the word resolve it, and I'm avoiding the word compromise it or anything, because I'm not sure that those are the target. But those fractious, acidic, accusatory, pugnacious Are you familiar with this? Interactions, and any of us who were here on Salt Spring during the sewer debates, just as an example. But it's only one. And it also raised in a lot of our minds, why is it that this happens on Salt Spring more than anywhere else in the world? And I'm not sure that was an accurate characterization of that question, but it just did seem, maybe because we were an island, that these problems were more passionately experienced here than anywhere else. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a sociologist, and I think we all have our guesses about why that might be the case, but there sure is a lot of passionate stuff that goes on here on public issues. And so we want to look at that. And what can the field of dispute resolution, conflict resolution do to bring something to bear on that whole interactive phenomenon, because that's what it is. Okay, and I thought before we tie into that, and to keep you awake right away, we should play a game. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and this will take a moment, and I won't ask you to do it right away, but just start thinking about, I'm going to ask you to just shape your chairs into groups of 4 or 5 or even 6, but just in a moment, get into groups right where you sit. And I'm going to hand out a fact situation which we'll read over together and then put you to work in these groups of 5 or 6. And you shouldn't have any trouble. Well, of course you'll have trouble. You shouldn't have too much trouble trying to solve the problem that you're presented with in your group. Okay? And that's going to be food for what we do for the rest of the evening. So why don't you, tell you what, before you get in the groups, we'll just hand these out. If you could hand those that way and that way. We'll see how far these go, and if we run short, we will share. Just hand them out, and we may have to pass some back. They're coming, they're coming. When they get to the end of the row, send them back. We'll read this over together. We probably need, we're going to run out. We'll need some people at the front who can read with someone beside them to pass their extra copies back. Is that all right? Back here. One. Who needs some at the back? Groups of 2. Great. In classic Salt Spring fashion. Loaves and fishes. Is there enough to go around? Okay. That's good. Oh, there's some extras there. That's good. Thank you. In the corner. Okay. So listen up and let's get a sense of who these characters are. So once upon a time, we have a woman named Abigail. That's your first character, who is in love with a man named Gregory. Gregory lived on the shore of a river. Abigail lived on the opposite shore of the river. The river which separated the lovers was teeming with man and woman eating alligators. Abigail wanted to cross the river to be with Gregory. That was her goal. Unfortunately, the bridge between them had been washed out. So she went to Sinbad, who is a riverboat captain, that's person number 3, to take her across. He said he would be glad to if she would consent to make love with him, preceding the voyage. You can imagine what that would have been like. She promptly refused and went to a friend, Ivan, to explain her plight. Ivan didn't want to be involved at all in the situation. But Abigail felt her only alternative was to accept Sinbad's terms. So she sadly consented to make love with Sinbad. Sinbad fulfilled his promise to Abigail and delivered her into the arms of Gregory. When she told Gregory about the promise and what Sinbad had made her do, Gregory cast her aside with disdain. Heartsick and dejected, Abigail turned to Slug with her tale of woe. Slug, feeling compassion for Abigail, sought out Gregory and beat him brutally. Abigail was overjoyed at the sight of Gregory getting his due. As the sun sets on the horizon, we hear Abigail laughing at Gregory. Okay? So, when you get into these groups of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, and you can just, it doesn't matter how many people in a group, I don't want you to act out these people. The assignment is this. As a group of however many of you there are, 4 or 5 or 6, see if you can come to a joint decision about whose behavior you most approve of and least approve of, and everybody in between. So as a group, the person of whose behavior you most approve will be number 1. The person of whose behavior you least approve will be number 5. Assuming these aren't people you would likely invite to dinner, that's not the point. But most approve and least approve. So maybe it's least disapprove and most disapprove. Your call, 1 to 5, and the assignment is decide that as a group. You have to discuss and come to a group decision, whatever that means. Any questions about the assignment? This won't take you longer than 15 or 20 minutes. So just shape up into groups of 5 or 6. Away you go, and we'll call you out of it.
If you're right now, I'm in trouble. Gary. Roger. I love these characters.
Looks like we have a lawyer.
All right. Okay, let's get back together. To get people on Salt Spring talking, and it's infectious. And I know for a fact there were several groups that weren't able to come to a group decision, and that's fine. But just for demonstration purposes, because this is meant to prove something, let's hear from a number of the groups that did find a solution. Did this group get to a group decision or not? Yes? Of whom did you most approve? Yeah, let's have the list. Okay? And number 2? Just reel them off. Who's number 2? Who, sorry, Slug? Least. Well, go most to least. Okay?
Gregory.
Yep.
Abigail.
Right?
And Sludge.
Okay. And what about the group over there, you guys? We'll just do a few of these.
We had a tie for the best, was between Ivan and the Slug.
Ivan and Slug, okay? And?
Was Sinbad by far.
Sinbad number 2?
Sinbad, yeah, he was the worst.
Oh, who's number 2?
We have 2 equal to do it.
We had, I think Abigail was 3. Yeah, Abigail was 3.
It was 3, all right. And who's number 4?
Gregory.
And Sinbad gets 5, good. And, yeah,
They're all incredibly stupid, these people.
dreadful people.
Adequate to stupidity.
Who's the
Ivan
worst?
being the least stupid was number 1.
Okay.
Number 2 is Abigail. Number 3 is Gregory. Number 4 is Slug. And number 5 is Sinbad.
Okay. A very moralistic group so far. What about,
Gregory 1.
he's the one you most approve of?
Yep. Ivan 2. Sinbad 3. Abigail 4. Slug 5.
Okay, great.
I can't believe number 1 were great.
Can't believe it. What's going on? And that group there.
We didn't come to a conclusion. We thought we had a conclusion, but then we started talking more about it.
Yeah.
Do you want our original conclusion before we start talking?
Well, did you come to a deal? You didn't. Well, let's not worry about that. Let's not worry about that. You didn't try.
Well, we
You were coming in late.
But we do, I mean, originally what we thought was that it was Ivan, then Sinbad, then Abigail, Gregory, and Slug. But then we were discussing about how Sinbad had a, what do you call it? A privilege of authority, a power of authority.
dynamic, I mean.
And then
You guys.
it never said that Gregory was in love with Abigail.
Right.
Abigail was in love with Gregory.
Right.
It's really not really part of the whole
Let's
thing.
hold off on this group until later. What about the four at the back?
We thought two things. Number one, we should hold a referendum.
Yeah.
And we thought number two, more seriously, we did not have nearly enough information to make a proper decision on ranking these people.
There must have been a lawyer and a designer in that group. Did you come to a conclusion? No, you didn't? Okay. Okay. How about this group that was here? No? Oh, good. Good. A conclusion meant everybody agreeing with one of the people.
Observation that our evaluations were very gendered.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
And that's really important.
Yes,
And
yes.
to me, the most important thing is you have to look at the first paragraph, because that's always the summary.
She's advocating.
Summary. Well,
You know, but you're right, yes. Important,
sir,
important.
I used to be an English teacher, and you always look at the first paragraph.
Okay.
And then the summary, and that tells you what the story's about.
Yeah, yeah. What about the group back here?
Well, first of all, there wasn't an admirable soul.
No, we know that. None of these people are coming for dinner.
We thought that Ivan was the least nasty.
Okay?
We thought that Gregory was the second least nasty. Because he was just kind of reacting out of his.
Who's number three?
Number 3 was Sinbad.
Sorry?
Sinbad was number 3.
Okay.
Abigail was number 4.
Okay.
And Slug was number 5.
Mr. Violence is getting bad grades. And then back here, was it, yep.
Yeah, we were absolutely convinced that the worst, do you want to talk about it? or not?
Best to
Best.
worst.
Okay, Gregory, best.
Okay?
Sinbad next.
Okay?
Ivan next. Slug next. And Abigail, the worst of the bunch, because the twit.
The anti-feminist group, good, okay? This is really interesting. What about it? Was that the group at the back? That was okay. Okay, okay. And was there a group here before we get to the very back? Yeah.
Number one, Sinbad.
Most approved of, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Number two, Abigail.
Okay.
Number 3, Ivan. Number 4, Slug. And number 5, a tie between Gregory and Peter Grove.
Okay. Is Gregory running for election? Do you know? And I think there's just one more group, right? Did you reach a conclusion? How'd you do?
Number 1 is Ivan,
Okay.
2 is Sinbad, 3 is Gregory, 4 is Abigail, 5 is Slug.
Okay. Great. Well, great. Thank you all for that. Weighing in on that. It's a bit of an effort, and it's artificial in so many ways. People are all artificial. Although somebody said this is just like Salt Spring. But also, you're being put under an unreasonable time crunch, and you don't really have a full chance to express, how strongly I feel about these various people. The other thing that's really interesting in this, and I have done this probably hundreds of times across Canada with different kinds of groups of people. But one of the interesting things is this is a big universe. 50 people is a big group, so you get truer responses. Statisticians will tell you. Secondly, you're all on the same rock. There's a bit of a culture to the extent there's any single-mindedness on Salt Spring at all. So we're getting some consistent results. Look at this. Slug is disapproved of. Slug is the guy that beats up just because he's asked to.
He wasn't.
Sorry?
He was not asked to.
Oh, sorry. She said.
She did not.
Oh, he just took it on his own. That's right. Thank you. You probably disappeared here. And Abigail is also quite heavily disapproved of. Sinbad gets off with medians. Ivan is the clear least disapproved of person in the group. Ivan who does nothing, right? Who refuses. Would that you were hot or cold. And this guy is sort of medium, sort of like Sinbad in a way. It's really interesting. But having said that, what this was meant to invite a little experience of is this whole business of wrestling with differing values, even within a group of 4 or 5 or 6. And from what I was hearing as I walked around, those differing values were certainly there. Somebody said based on gender, certainly based on different circumstances of life, based on strong feelings about what one of these characters' particular temperament might be. Others concerned about not adequate facts. We don't know enough. We would need more before we made that important decision. All of that stuff happens whenever you're dealing with this kind of dispute. Is it a dispute? What's really going on here isn't so disputatious. It's really more just a conflict of values as you assess these people. It's more a conflict of values when you assess these people. And that was something that hit me, that distinction was something that hit me a few years ago. I'll tell you, it hit me a few years ago when I was mediating the dispute in the Anglican Diocese of New Westminster over same-sex blessings, which eventually, as you probably know, caused a bit of a schism. I realized, as a fairly experienced mediator by then, that I was out of my depth. I didn't have the tools. I just didn't have the equipment needed to deal with this. And I was trying to deal with it as a dispute between different factions of a communion. And it wasn't a dispute. I mean, there's lots of disputey things about it, but it was really a completely different take on reality between these two groups, which continues to this day, as a lot of Salt Spring situations continue. And there was a real distinction to make between those two things. What two things? Well, I keep using this word, and when we use that, at least in English, I think what we're referring to, and what we're certainly referring to in the DR field, dispute resolution field, we're referring to disagreement, all right? Something known to law, for instance, something where the issues are crystallized enough and clear enough that we can lock horns. I think it should be this way, I think it should be that way. It doesn't matter why we think that, we disagree. And that is a problem. And it may be a problem because one of us is suing the other, or it may just be a problem because we really, really disagree. For instance, a classic thing on this island that I used to get about one a year as a lawyer. Someone cuts down trees, and the trees are arguably on someone else's property, or if they're not, they're in an easement or a right-of-way that someone just didn't know about, or something like that, something having to do with trees. And it's nice and tight. You've got finite trees, you've got an act that really occurred with a chainsaw, you got the tree lying there. There are values at stake here, but they're economic values. People are charged by the way they feel, but really they just have a disagreement over what should flow from this. All right? And that's music to a mediator's ear because it's negotiable. The parties can negotiate about that. They can sit down, if they can just give their heads a shake, and have a discussion about what they're going to do about the trees lying on the ground. All right? That's different from what you just did, which was you dealt with conflicts of values. And when I use that word, again, these are just metaphors. When I use that word, I'm not talking so much about disagreement as, difference. So, it may be that underlying our disagreement about those trees is a whole different set of values about what a tree means. Someone, son or daughter of a faller, and they live their whole life with trees falling all over and somebody else named them, and You used to go out and have seances with them. I don't know. So that there's a whole different approach to the value of that asset. So that, yeah, this might be easy, but it's going to be fed by this. And the extent to which this gets ratcheted up, this becomes harder. But they're quite distinct, right? So people who have separated and have children, and it's been 3 or 4 years, and the transfer of kids back and forth and extracurricular expenses and all that stuff has gone fairly smoothly between. They can talk reasonably well on the phone with each other. There's occasional fractiousness, but things have smoothed out. And then they have a disagreement over, I don't know, summer camp for some kid. And that may be fed by religious values, questions about what parent should have primacy, question about whether or not the kid is really being honest about whether they want to go to something. All this stuff feeds that dispute. Why am I making this distinction? Any guesses?
I think the first one's much more soluble and
Yeah.
can be solved.
It really
The second
is.
one really is much harder.
Yeah, these are disputes we really think are capable of resolution. So when you have, let me think of a restorative justice problem that we did on Salt Spring. 17-year-old gets drunk. Gosh, did he get drunk? Yes. With another 17-year-old, and they buzz through town, knocking down people's fence posts and all kinds of other things. Finally,
Flower box.
flower pots too. You're in on
Flower
that.
pots.
And the kids, they've done them wrong, and they acknowledge that they've done this wrong, and they need to meet with some of these owners and the police and decide what's going to flow from this. And they may have disagreements about who knocked down what, or whether or not that was already knocked down when we passed by your place, and they can pose and strut over that. But this is really resolvable, because it's a nice, finite problem. The parties are identified, the issue is identified, they can work this out, because it's negotiable. If either side has strong views about what those damn kids need to be taught, or, oh gee, it wasn't that big a thing, it was just a prank, they're going to have conflicting perceptions of reality that will get in the way of dealing with this. Comments, anybody?
So would you say in a dispute you have to come to a decision, whereas in a conflict you have to come to an agreement? Would that be sort of?
I don't think that's going to be that simple,
Yeah.
right? As your group demonstrated, and well, maybe not yours so much, but some groups demonstrated. It's really hard to just isolate those values and say, oh, well, I guess I can agree with you. When you're talking about right to life or right to choice or any of those major issues.
To deal with the conflicts types and the different values. Are there a different set of tools, or is that still to be developed?
We're going to come there. But the good news is we're going to talk about that a little bit, I'm hoping. The bad news is I don't think it has been developed. Ta-da.
Well, I'm wondering, my sense is that when it comes to the values, if right off people are able to say, this is my value, and why I need to defend it, I will hear yours, if we hear each other's value first, then perhaps it will open us more.
As maybe part of the answer to what you're raising. Maybe.
Yeah.
Here's what I think the so-called science of conflict resolution has been playing with over the last 30 years. We acknowledge that generally we want at the end of a problem an outcome. Sometimes called a solution, doesn't really matter. That outcome is the nice solid thing that there is agreement about or that a court delivers. On the way to that outcome, the most primitive way to haggle over it is for each party to take what we call positions, which are usually opposing stances that then get hammered away at or negotiated about. A slightly more enlightened way to deal with that, sort of arose in the 70s and 80s, is to talk about, well, just a minute, what are the interests, it's just jargon, that inform those positions. So these things might be the things that we regard as really essential. Gotta haves, needs, desires, I want, concerns, things that cause anxiety. Just breezing through these, we could spend days and days.
Freedom from violence in the community.
For instance, fears, hopes. And so some social scientists in the late 70s, early 80s said, well, just a minute, if we deconstruct these that are typically the sort of bargaining that goes on between people and identify the things that inform them, and those things are these, holy crow, it'll be easier to come to this. And most mediators use that tool, more or less, to try to enlighten the parties at the table about what is it they're really trying to get out of any solution, any outcome. Now, what we haven't paid much attention to is what you were just doing. Interests are informed, in turn, by values. And the field, our field, that a number of you have worked in for a while, a long time, get these mixed up. So they think there's just kind of this soup of softer things that inform these. And what we're learning is, well, just a minute, no, these inform these, but there's something even deeper. And so, a bunch of writers, Burton, got a couple Canadian writers as well, have begun talking about these in terms of deeper values or core values. And they'll say that it's our core values that actually inform our needs, desires, which then in turn inform our positions. And some of you will be glazing over and thinking, what does this matter? Patience, we're almost there. To make matters worse, this is informed by who I think I am. Not what do I value, but who am I at core, what we would call identity. So, no development on Grace Island. The hell no, there will be development on Grace Island. No, there won't. Positions. Here's what we're concerned about. Each side can articulate that. Informed by social and individual and cultural values that have probably never been inquired about. Defined by, but I'm First Nation. But I'm a developer. I'm government. I'm an environmental. You with me? Yeah. So these labels that we accord to others, it's usually appropriated, or that we give ourselves, really are the base of who we perceive ourselves to be. I don't do that because I'm a Christian. I do this because I'm a lesbian. I do this because I'm young. We have these identities that are more than just attributes about ourselves. They're actually who we perceive ourselves to be. Comment?
Have you heard of this research that apparently political meanings are related to the way brains are functioning, that certain political leanings, the brains tend towards more fear, and other political leanings, the brains tend towards more...
I think I remember hearing something about that.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I suspect that's part of it too.
And my wife, Marla, will be happy to hear that because she and I tussle. We have a value difference over the extent to which that kind of stuff is mechanical.
Well,
although maybe that's not entirely fair. but there's no dispute, right? Because we can get by just fine during the day, but we know that there's that difference. But I take your point.
The identity is also a sociological phenomenon.
Sure.
So that we will associate with a group.
Sure.
So if you're a contractor, Grace Island, and your boss and you've gotten hired, you want to, you agree with a certain place. More than someone who has been...
Maybe. So
yeah,
whatever that identity is that you can claim yourself or as part of a group helps inform these throughout life. I mean, this is way before we're very conscious. And it's real, these things don't change much, which then define the kind of thing that mediators tend to dig into, because we're really interested in this stuff, which usually deconstructs these so that these are easier to get to. So what, for purposes of this discussion today, because this is all very heady, the most important thing I think I'll do today is this. This line is what's important. Ta-da! Because these are usually associated, not entirely, with dispute. These are more usually associated with conflict, as we made that distinction a moment ago. And a number of people have observed, and I've certainly observed in my practice, but Linda, you have in yours, and other people have, that this stuff is usually pretty negotiable. Yeah, we can work out times for the kids being returned after they've been with mom. We can work out who's going to cover post-secondary education. But we can work these things out, even though we may have strong views about what's right. All right? As long as we can talk about what we want out of this for the kids, we're likely going to get to one of those. But if the dispute isn't really about post-secondary expense, but it's all about what money really means, and what accountability really means, and what it was like living with you for 15 fucking years, and all that stuff. And it's going to be just one of those awful, fractious discussions. And they're going to be here, and these tend to be non-negotiable. And that's the problem with dealing with you. You're just the kind of person who will never... You hear that?
Oh, that's right.
That's the one. So, generally speaking, I'm coming to the conclusion, and there's a lot of people who are, I think, in this field, these things are really hard to get resolution of. Whether you're a mediator, or whether you're the parties just talking together, or whether you're on the demonstration line with placards, whether you're debating and trying to persuade somebody, if it's really based in this, same-sex blessing in the Anglican Church, classic example, but not the only one, it's really going to be hard to get resolution. The outcome is going to be something else. If it's based on this kind of stuff, then it's highly negotiable. And the bad news is, my bad news is, well, there's lots of bad news, isn't there? My bad news is, I don't think the kind of disagreement or kind of dispute gives you much of a window into where you're going to be. Let me put that more elegantly. I don't think the nature of the dispute necessarily defines whether it's going to be richly endowed with values and identity, or whether it's just going to be this kind of bargaining stuff. Because I've been in both situations where you'll have multi-parties, First Nation, municipality, company that wants to divert a river, Canada, BC, they're all at the table. And it's charged with different views of reality and worldviews, you think. But man, they have no trouble. They just work out what's going to happen. River diversion, temperatures, flows, salmon counts, all gets done. And you're thinking, but this was supposed to be difficult. In the same way, you can remember mediation in Victoria, I don't know, 15 years ago, where it was a very standard disagreement about what's this injury worth for an old guy. I don't know, he was then old, he was 55. Young man. A stout guy, he was a blue-collar worker, he was wearing a tweed jacket, and he had his neck in a neck brace. The accident was 2 years ago. He had a permanent injury, and had suffered a lot, and it was worth a fair bit of money. But they were really just talking about what is this thing worth, and it was a transactional discussion. There's none of this going on at all. You had the insurance corporation there, and the guy there, and the head lawyers. And curiously, somebody asked him from the defense side of the table, so when did you first realize that you were seriously injured? He said, well, after the car flipped over and I was thrown from the car, I woke up on the ground and heard the police say, you better bring a body bag for this one. And he bursts into tears. This big, tough man starts crying. And everyone, doesn't know what to do, and they're all embarrassed. And I realized, oh, well, just a minute. This is about something else. It's about I'm a dead man, or I'm entitled to be treated differently than a chunk of cheese that's been damaged and is worth some money. And this discussion had to happen for a while before they could get back to that, because there's no way he was going to accept anything, didn't matter what the money was, until there was acknowledgement that he had been changed by this accident. So what I'm saying there is, it can be a big social multi-party debacle of the sort that you've been involved in, Kathy, and others have, and it may not be down here at all. It usually is, but it may not be. Or it can be just a transactional thing about the value of something, and you think, oh gosh, oh no, we're down here. No telling, so that's the bad news. Comments?
Question. There's an assumption there that values and identity piece, it's a monolith, and it's cast in stone. In my experience, not so much. With probing the process, if we can adapt the process so that the individual parties will do some radical things like asking questions of themselves, introspection, to check out those values, to probe their own identities, they'll find that perhaps they're not exactly what they thought they were in the first place. What we immediately do is go to position, and then all the various accelerants go to work and fan the flames. But if we could interject some introspection and self-analysis on the part of both parties, or how many parties there are, but just find out where are our heads really at. Do we really hate gay people?
Interesting, yeah. A dotted line down from this to foray into here for a bit. And then the skills and the process needed to achieve that.
I'd also add to that sometimes in those kind of discussions, if you really are open to what the other person is saying, you can see that your values aren't as different as you think they are. The other person is maybe not a terrible person, that they actually have the same positive things in mind.
Yeah, and that's just sheer lovely. It's lovely. But don't assume that's going to happen. Because you may discover when you make that inquiry, oh yeah, they're just as bad an animal as I ever thought they were. And it makes me even more certain that I'm right. And even less willing to abandon my values, because they're not negotiable. So if in a cut and preserve problem, a development versus natural habitat problem, if one side has to convince the other to drop their chainsaws, or one side has to convince the other to clear, it's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to parse out that. They have to, I'm sure, engage in some sort of understanding where they suspend some stuff, and we'll come to that in a moment, I hope. But where they also acknowledge, hey, I'm the way I am, and the people I associate with are the way we are, and we're entitled to be the way we are. This is very good stuff, in my view.
Identity tends to be tied up with feeling. There's a movement in schools now to get kids to talk about their feelings when they're in conflict.
What a strange idea.
Would you ever, do you ever as a mediator ask people how they feel, or is it all about thinking?
Depends on the mediation, doesn't it? Like in that business with the fellow in the neck brace, until he started talking about his experience waking up, there wasn't a whole lot of feeling involved for anybody. ICBC has no feelings, or they say they don't. But sure, yeah, you're going to want to make that inquiry.
Well, the reason I'm asking that is because particularly with males, we're taught at a very young age to hide our feelings. And therefore it would be quite logical to expect in a mediation situation that matters of identity, which can be completely different one party against the other, are related to feeling, and therefore until you actually address this issue of feeling and get each party to respect where the other's coming from, you're not going to make any progress.
Maybe right. I say maybe right because in a situation where it's important that feelings get understood, when I say feelings, I mean fears of economic loss, concern about loss of the right to decide, compromise of the natural environment, and that just hurts people. I mean, actually, it's awful, those experiences. So where you, a mediator, let's talk to you for a moment, where you sense that that's the case, or before the interaction you realize that's the case, or where in the midst of it you think, oops, that's the case, then of course you raise those questions and ask people to talk about their feelings if they will. Sometimes they won't. It's a bunch of hands, so why don't we hear from these people and then we'll go on. Yeah?
So I think what about situations where there are no mediators?
Yeah.
And there's really no evident way for one to be inserted into the situation.
Which is usually the case here.
And two, which is probably also usually the case there, where the conflict, what started out as perhaps a dispute, quickly revealed as a conflict, then becomes intensely and virulently personalized in the form of personal attacks. Attacks on, not physical attacks, but just
lots of attacks. Public attacks. Well, let me say, I think the first response to that, because your question was, what about the situations where there aren't helpers, assisting people, mediators, facilitators, whoever they might be? The first thing is to have some sense of this list. I mean, so for participants to have some sense of that list, for us all to. In your next disagreement with someone, know that it's probably capable of resolution with a good discussion. And if you can have a good discussion yourself because you're skilled or able to pipe down or get a hold of those aggressive feelings, great. If you need a third party to step in and help, hire some of these people, they're great. That's up here. But also know, just a minute, this is really about a disagreement between us about who we think we are and who we think the other is because of who they are, and how our differences in values are really paramount here. And I think if we know that we're north or south of this line, it makes a difference. Without that third party, it makes a difference to our own capacity, I think. I don't know if that's part of an answer, but that's what I'm coming to now. There's a bunch of other hands. Yeah?
What that speaks to me a little bit is some of the ways in which we communicate with each other. So if we're in that values identity part,
right,
and we're in, because of the way the process unfolds, or because of media, or because of the public aspect, it further entrenches, as this fellow was saying, it further entrenches us. To me, the challenge then is, or the question is, how do we shift how we are and interact with each other? That speaks to media to me oftentimes, because I think when you're facilitating divisiveness rather than facilitating understanding, you get people who might have been okay up there who end up coming all the way down, because then there's more at stake.
I'm sure that's wisdom. So we need to turn to that question in the last 45 minutes. How do we, the how-to question, which I claimed at the beginning, I don't have clear answers to. Nobody has written this book yet. One of you may be the person who does this for your PhD, I don't know. But there need to be clear answers. And I think we have some legs up. I want to get to people who haven't had a chance yet. How about you?
I just wanted to comment on one of the pieces, as to what you said. One of the pieces, if we're going into a conflictual situation and that's very heated and we have the sense where we need an objective third party, it's vital to have a clear sense of self. Where am I at? Do I want to bite their head off? Identity. If we're in that place, I'll back up a bit, where in our society we haven't been taught the tools for common, collaborative, consensual conflict resolution. We don't have those tools under our belt. It hasn't been modeled for us. So it's what I witness with a lot of people, is, including myself, is adrenaline gets spiked and then we want to fight. And then we say, okay, let's resolve this right now. Right. But we're really not in the mind state to resolve anything. And so
it's hard to do that without help. I think that help is helpful.
Having a clear sense of where we're at in this graph in terms of whether we're really ready to move up that scale is really important.
And can we identify these loud and clear for ourselves publicly and for the other group? It wouldn't hurt for those of you who find yourself in constituency to meet as a group and chart these things. You know, what is it that really juices us? What is it that fuels us? What's important to us? And you know, we've developed this over the years. Who do we think we are anyhow? I mean, that's so that you're ready for that discussion.
If I can add, thank you, Gordon. If I can add one more piece, is that when we feel threatened, we want to attack. And so especially when it's close to our heart, our values. So self-compassion, okay, like I'm feeling threatened right now, and that's the place that I'm coming from, and my values are safe, they're close to me, nobody can really tear them down from me, and maintaining a solid sense of self when we go into, when we move up the ground to negotiate.
And have the courage to be able to articulate those dispassionately when, not if, the other says, that's typical of you. You just blah, 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 and out comes a great list of your deficiencies in their view, right? And you just feel like it's snakes and ladders. Let's go
I
here.
might be directly on target, but remember Ted Hughes in the residential schools? He said that some of them, all they wanted to do was be heard.
Right.
So I guess they went straight from the identity.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's a good take, isn't it? Yeah. Wow.
I wonder if it isn't easier to come up with values because they're more conscious. You know, it's if you do a little bit of work, you can say, well, I really care about this. That's important to me. But identity, I wonder if that isn't more unconscious. And because it's formed when you're so young, and there are things that you don't really think about being a woman. You don't really think about that you're in this generation. You know, you don't really think that you come from the prairies. But all these things, they're more unconscious, and thus maybe they cause more trouble.
Yeah, and yet they're instrumental in feeding all this stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think I hear, I haven't charted this, but I think I hear more appropriation of other people's values than claiming of our own. Other people's identity than claiming of our own in mediation. I don't know if that checks out with others who mediate. It's just, you know, that's what's wrong with you people, you blah, 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 blah. and that's you know, the elder, I don't know, whatever. Saying things about people as a group or people as individuals, which appropriates particular values and characteristics to somebody. A lot more of that comes out in these discussions than what you were saying. Taking a moment to articulate and be clear about, here's who I am in this discussion. Here's who we are. Here's who we see ourselves to be, right? So we'll come to that too. Let's go here and there and there.
Would you say that appropriating someone else's value or explaining someone else, that could be valuable in a situation where you're trying to understand the other person? Gordon, I'm hearing that these are your values. Am I right in that?
Right.
That's not necessarily negative if it's done in a constructive way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the ways ahead that we'll identify starting in about 5 minutes. I think that's right. Checking that out, being curious about it, being genuinely interested in it, even though you may flatly disagree with the value. Don't have to agree. Don't have to agree down here. You know, the whole business is trying to come to an agreement up here. We just have to appreciate the difference, and it's very difficult. We were going to go here, right? I think that's right.
I think, and following from the last comment, we're back in some senses to this sense of what is at stake. Is one's identity to a great degree is constituted by a process of distinguishing oneself morally, even though that's a sort of tacit understanding, like it's an unspoken view of self, that I have occupied a higher moral ground here. I've lived longer, I have more wisdom, and so on. But and I don't think it's a neutral thing. But it seems to me that what is at stake really is how does one communicate one's position and the degree to which one is open to hearing
one's
and
position
really
or this stuff.
Listening and empathizing with someone else's position, even though morally you feel that you stand on very solid ground.
The most powerful things I hear down here are when someone has the courage and inclination to say, you know, it's interesting, you and I disagree, it's this word, this disagreement thing, disagree about a lot of things. And in particular, we disagree about all the values that we're trying to see realized in any solution here. And you know what, John, I think we can disagree about that and still get somewhere. So normalizing the fact that we're entitled to be diverse. Yeah. Let's go to Linda and then we'll come back this way.
A couple of things, thank you. The dotted line, one of the things that we're doing in mediation is to say what is discussable and what's negotiable.
Yeah.
And the discussables are those values and that identity,
Mm-hmm.
and then understanding that.
Negotiable, discussable.
Absolutely, and in some cases, we can't move to the negotiables until we do the discussables.
Mm-hmm.
Until we hear the heart, we hear the values that are
Mm-hmm.
represented, and the person who, and see the person. And I would say, true, that we often don't understand what our core values are, neither do we understand our core identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in that conversation that we can have as mediator, and it may happen in pre-mediation. It may happen, I'm doing lots of work in conflict coaching, it may happen there where on the one-to-one conversations we can begin to break open some of this valuable understanding of self, so that when people come together, they're coming because they've answered some of their own questions before they have to sit with the other's questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I also suggest that values, while may be formed early in our lives, are also often prioritized. And so the concept of coming in and saying, these are my top 5 values, and so I can't agree with you. My experience is that we are always sort of prioritizing those values. So they are intrinsic to us, they're important to us, and for instance, I don't want to come to mediation because I don't feel respected.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't feel what?
Respected.
Respected, or adequately respected.
And so what are some other values that are floating around there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really strongly believe in collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
So how are these two?
And that's not a this, that's a that, isn't it?
That's right. And so how do we work with that?
Mm-hmm.
Those values that may have a greater or later or lesser weighting.
One of the things I think Linda's saying, and you said earlier, was, you know, we have to address these before we can get to this in many of these situations. There's another writer and colleague of mine who says, no, it's not so much doing this before we do that. Sometimes you just can't cross this line. And his mantra is, how do we take these which are not negotiable and find disputes in them that then can be negotiated? Just fascinating. How can we re-express these in terms of disagreement that we can then get our talons into? Because we're not gonna negotiate and find solutions, find resolution to our difference. We're entitled to our difference. You had your hand up.
Fascinating. I figured that if I want to do something with my car and I'm not quite sure where to go, I need to put the brake on, go into neutral, and rethink things. So I have this idea that if your belief system is the rudder of your magic carpet, and that shuts everybody out.
Right.
And right away, it gives you permission to say, I'm a Muslim, I don't believe in that.
Right.
And you're not going to hit me because I say that, but it puts it into neutral, so you can talk about those things that are below the belt then.
I'm a Muslim and I don't believe. I'm a Muslim and this is what I believe. I'm a Mormon and, you know, all that stuff.
And so then you can open up the discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one or two other comments, then we want to move on.
I just have the feeling if you've got a linear flow there. If you went down the other way from identity and went right up to income, to outcome,
I think I'll be okay too, but.
The example you gave at the beginning of the river, the real village there with the crocodiles.
Mm-hmm.
And if
kind of got together and eliminated the crocodiles,
Right.
then they would all disappear.
Right.
You know, you really don't need to consider the identity and values of interests of the individuals if you just agree that what the real problem is. If you want to reduce class sizes because it's beneficial to the kids and the teachers, agree that that is a desirable outcome. To build a new fire hall, that's a desirable outcome. You go straight to that, and all of these personal, the values and the identities, to me, don't really matter. You know, I think I would just like to go straight to the solution and let people fall by the wayside or gather along with me to get to the goal.
Right, and that is a huge temptation for most people.
Yeah.
just drain Ganges Harbor, and you don't have an outlet anymore. Deal done.
Yeah, but that's how things get done.
They do. That's how government does things. Make decisions and impose those decisions. I want to begin to develop a list. After Peter gives a political, no, go ahead.
You've been skirting around it and we've talked about it in small letters. It should be in bold and underlined. It's all about understanding. When it comes to values, that's what we need to focus on, getting people to understand one another by talking to one another. Because they don't need to agree, as you said earlier, that you get people understanding where one another is coming from. And if they want a resolution, they will find a resolution to understand one another where they're coming from.
And the confusion, for most of us, I think, in English, between understanding and agreeing is huge. It's just plain huge. So for third parties, I think that can mean a short sermon. You know, listen, by the way, as you two talk about what's important to you and what's foundational to you and what's at the core of your own experience of life, accept that you do not have to agree with each other. You have to say it 4 or 5 times. When you're not a mediator, but you're just one of the two parties engaged in that kind of dispute, you may have to say, I want to understand where you're coming from, and I can almost assure you that I won't agree. And I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I think we need to be fully educated here, you know? You can say those things. And you don't hear people say that stuff. Maybe because it's too touchy-feely.
Bring it back to Salt Spring. Here...
We've been on Salt Spring throughout this whole thing.
Okay. But in the bigger one, we, when it comes to islands, trust, and island related issues, we form allies. We come as two camps, basically, right? But I think you know what
multiple
I mean.
camps.
And I'm thinking that when you were with the Anglican people, the people who thought that way looked for the allies, and the allies stuck together. Isn't that happening?
Yes, that's constituency. People who are like-minded over an issue, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. we identify, and there's all kinds of subgroups in this room over specific issues that would identify in various ways. Nothing wrong with that.
But that helps us hang on to our value if we do that.
Yeah, it makes us more sure of our value and what we think. It doesn't reduce the necessity for us to be clear with those who don't agree with us about what we think and to be curious about what they think. Even though we're pretty sure we know exactly what they think. So, Chief, you know, if we had 3 or 4 days, I think we could do some role playing and a real introspection about some of these suggested ways ahead. But I want to give you a cheap version of them because we have a few minutes, and then we'll talk more and do more questions. One of the things that's been useful for me has been Fisher and Urey getting to yes, you know them. Bill Urey is fond of saying there are always 3 possible procedural outcomes, procedural approaches to conflict. And he doesn't use the word conflict and dispute the way we have been today, but he kind of means the same thing. One of them is, what can the other do? So not you, but the other, assuming that there's 2. These camps maybe you're talking about, or just individuals. What the other can do is one of those procedural, things. And we can't control what the other can do. The other can scream and rant, the other can run away, they can do something violent, they can sit there like a bump on the log and pretend they're not involved, like Ivan. They can do all kinds of stuff like that. But we can't control that. We can try to manipulate it and influence it, but we can't control it. The second thing is, what can a third party do? We've talked a little bit about that, and there's huge value. I don't mind saying this, it's not anything. There's huge value in the right circumstances to two opposing groups getting a facilitative force in that room. Just someone who is a third party and isn't involved in the dispute and can simply help the process of communication and all the other procedural stuff that's going on. There's lots of proof of that. What the other can do, what a third party can do, and then of course what you can do. So let's look at some of these things, and we're not going to flesh them out in any detail because we need to, well, it takes too much time. But one of them, and it's been mentioned, is curiosity. So we have to exhibit the fact that we don't know the other's identity, instead of appropriating their identity unto them, and that we're curious, mildly curious, maybe even quite curious, about who the heck they are, first of all. And secondly, what juices them, what fuels them, what's the stuff behind whatever interests they have that they're presenting. And we have to show and maintain that curiosity. And that's going to take a shift up here, it seems to me, not just a procedural shift. The process is a set of skills, right? Asking questions, asking the other to talk a bit about themselves, maybe going to feeling if it's a feeling-based issue, acknowledging your own ignorance of where they're coming from, and posing questions to encourage them to talk about that. Second thing I think would be useful is another Bill Urey trick, and he describes it as invite criticism. It's the counterintuitive thing, criticism and advice. So when someone is saying, the trouble with you people, identity, the trouble with you people is you don't care about the local economy, you don't care about jobs, all you care about is mindless preservation. And you can just feel the hair on your back going up. Help me out here so I can understand that better. How is it that we're falling short of your expectation? Right? Let me know what we should be doing differently that would be more in accord with what you're after. Now he's going to talk about his values and maybe less about our identity. Do you follow me? So invite criticism and advice, not as a ploy, but as a genuine expression of curiosity. It's counterintuitive. It's not the thing we want to do. What do we want to do when we hear that kind of stuff? Yeah, defend ourselves, counter it, prove that he's wrong. Because he's wrong, we think. Then the St. Francis thing, sorry. Seek to understand. It's a bit like curiosity, but it's not exactly the same. So it's one thing for me to be curious, but then when I get the answer, it's going to come in a code that I don't necessarily get. Why would I get it? I don't necessarily share their values. It's almost certain that I don't share some of their values. And I'm not them. Identity's different. So when I do stuff with First Nations in BC, for instance, these are parties, typically the people at the table. There'll be several from each of those two organizations, those large social units, like a province or a country. And they know each other really well because they work together all the time. And they're talking about differences in policy. And they need to move that conversation, and the facilitator tries to help them into here. Who do we see ourselves to be? What is essential to us, and why is it essential to us? But when they say that, someone has to help the hearer understand the message, because it's code usually. I mean, it's English of a sort, but what do you mean by that? You know, I'm not sure I understand. So the third party can play as dumb as he is and encourage a more fulsome description, right? If there isn't a third party, play as dumb as you are. You're not them. And when people are expressing things at a values level, it's unlikely that we're going to get it first time, or maybe second time. So seek to understand the meaning of what's being said after you've been curious about it and ferreted it out. Yeah, darn it. Oh, there it is. Oh, yeah. Make explanations about stuff, but make explanations, not arguments. And this is really hard. Do we give an E to argument? No? Okay. The English do, I think. Anybody English?
Yeah.
Do they? Okay. They don't?
No.
Judgment they do sometimes?
Judgment sometimes.
Okay, sometimes. Okay. All right. So we can explain where we're coming from, and we can explain what we meant, and we can filter and demystify the code, but we shouldn't get into arguments. Resist the temptation to engage in a debate. Again, for those who are extroverts or highly judgmental, I'm both, it's really hard to do because you want to defend yourself. You want to prove the truth of what you're talking about, the factual and other kinds of truths of what you're talking about. So we want to engage in that. Don't take the bait. Yeah, and this may seem stupid, but it's not. If what we said about conflict and dispute is accurate, avoid negotiation. You'll only compromise, and you'll be compromising values and identity, and you can't compromise who you are. So I'm thinking that when the discussion is really deeply embedded in values and identity, don't involve yourself in a negotiation. Do this stuff instead. It's all about education, learning, revealing, and letting it go. You don't have to always come to a conclusion, all right? Because just doing that much may elevate you into a place where conflicts can be where disputes can be identified, and then they are negotiable. And we'll talk about this in a moment. All this stuff. Oh yeah, and acceptance. And of the other's values. Sorry, I don't mean agreement with the other's values. And identity. I did a wonderful mediation in Alberta, I don't know, a few years ago, after moving to, so it was 7 or 8 years ago, between a huge Hutterite colony. These are enormous farms, you guys. They're huge. You involve hundreds and hundreds of people living in community, very tightly ordered social structure, highly productive hog farmers, highly mechanized, way better than the non-Hutterites around them in every direction. And so there's all kinds of pressure from municipalities and counties on the government to regulate these bastards because they're taking too much of this or too much of that, or there's smell, or there's dust in the air in the summer, or I heard those guys had to put down some hogs because of a disease and nobody seems to be able to put the finger, and so there's this values-based, identity-based disagreement about who these people are and ought to be allowed to be. And of course, the Hutterites feel just as strongly. Part of their whole social structure is that government shouldn't be allowed to tell them what to do, and they don't ask for anything from government. They're not after safety net payments or any of that stuff, security. Just leave us alone to be us. So it's very much an identity-based and values-based dispute. They have to, government as institutional as it is, Hutterites as institutional as they are, and they are, have to accept the values and the identity of the other before they can even have an intelligent discussion. They have to do that, and they don't have to agree. You know, I may be setting the cat among the pigeons here, but I think on Salt Spring, it's not a good thing that you would agree with the values of those that you profoundly disagree with. Let me run that by again. I don't think it's good for us to be pretending that we are like the other just so that it's nice and positive. Or that we really agree with them after all. Because sometimes we do, but more often, darn it, we don't. Our ethic is our ethic, whatever it is. Brown, green, left, right, doesn't really matter. And we're entitled to those differences. Those differences are what makes, makes society society, for one thing. But it's also, that conflict stuff is also very good for communities. It's good for social development. There's nothing wrong with the fact that people flatly disagree with each other on this island over major policy issues. Nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is, what? The way they do it.
Yeah.
And that's why we're here. So, you know, increasingly, forces like the 50 people in this room need to think about, when I'm a part of that, because I will be, how can I change the discussion just a bit? How can I gradually change the nature of the discussion that would go on about fire hall property? You know, am I going to defend and debate, or am I going to really encourage a broad discussion at an almost town hall level and see where that takes us? I think the same is true about everything. And some of those holy values about Grace Islet, for instance, gosh, doesn't matter how holy they are, we can talk about them, we can talk about where we disagree and how we disagree, and maybe that will elevate the whole question to a place where it becomes a definable dispute and we can work out negotiable outcomes for that dispute. Okay, comments? Yes?
Sort of getting back to this idea of staying in that area of values and identity, I think for me it's really helpful to believe and know that humans are capable of transformation. And I heard about this one thing that happened in the States where they got people who were on the left and right, sort of really opposing together. And they made a timeline, and people would go like 6 years old, 12 years old, and they would say about things that affected them in the direction of their lives and their values at that time. And that helped them really understand each other. Yeah.
And when you talk about transformation, you're saying that there's some change as a result of that understanding?
Yeah, like I look at my own life a lot when I'm dealing with other people, and I remember the transformations in my own life. And I think that helps me really believe that people can change their values and identity.
And I think it's well recognized that changes down here happen very slowly. They just do. I mean, they happen to us all, and we can identify some of those watersheds over the years. Changes up here, you know, this is highly negotiable, and people will assess things, talk with their friends for 25 minutes, and make a decision. It's remarkable. But this stuff is very gradual. Other hands. Hand there, hand there.
One of the biggest things that I've observed in these different disagreements over policies on Salt Spring in regard to the back and forth confrontational behavior, both in meetings and in the paper and out in the street, is that as humans, when someone disagrees with us, we take it personally. And that person isn't doing that because of me. It's the one thing that our mindset that we can change that can be really helpful, and is to not take things personally. And if anyone's read The Four Agreements by Miguel Ruiz, that book has changed my life so much in regard to those kinds of things. And so it's just a suggestion, but at the same time I've seen that transformation, which our friend just spoke of, in my own life. And when someone comes up to me like that and confronts me, I don't take it personal. They're not doing it because of me. They're doing it because of their values. And I understand that.
It's interesting. And it's something you can't change in them.
That's right.
And if they're actually doing it because of them, not because of you, which is sometimes hard to believe.
But it's the truth every time.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I don't know your name, you were speaking earlier.
Karen.
Yeah, Karen. And moving also into what you're speaking of, when that adrenaline pops up, there's another lesson in those teachings from the Toltec that I learned. And that when that adrenaline pops up, instead of having an instant brain-to-mouth response like most of us tend to do, I've come to train myself to, I stop, I breathe, and then I emote.
Yeah.
Take a break.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
take that break.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Like, if you have to put yourself in a bubble, it works.
Anna, was your hand up at the back? Did it come and go?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think I'm listening to a lot of this conversation about the values and shifting values, and I think I don't really know what's going on in Salt Spring, to be honest. But
Nobody really does. So
But I think we spend a lot of time assuming that we know what the other is saying.
Yeah.
And so we shift ourselves into these positions and these attitudes that I understand that person, and that person's never going to be able to surprise me at all. Ever. And I think we don't spend a lot of time listening. And my experience in the last little bit has been that if you do take that time, that 5 minutes, even though you've categorized that group of people or that individual, that your value, my values have shifted in listening. And I've seen, you know, where I work, you would never see that people could come together, and they do. And that shift is like this, because they just suddenly realize that, oh, that person's human too. And so I think that values, I think the values are really important, but I do think that there's a positioning within the value system that has to be acknowledged. And that we have to spend more time listening, maybe. That's all I want to say.
And one or two hands, when we go there, there. And then we're probably time to wrap up.
We are mostly here, not most of us, many of us are here because of the issues that come up time and time again on Salt Spring.
Right.
This isn't a family dispute, this isn't a dispute between employees and whatever. It's
Almost always a public dispute.
public groups.
Yeah.
We have a very unfortunate way of communication, whether it's formal or informal or in the media or letters to the whatever. How do we, I mean, we have a group of people who obviously are open to change and want to figure out ways to do that. Most of the island isn't here. How do we affect any change of way of operation with the island as a whole?
And I'm not gonna, I can't even. You know, there have got to be systems answers to that, and some of you in this room are charged with that. There's a bunch of process answers, and then I think there's a whole bunch of skills answers under each of these processes. How might I ask that differently? How might I change my tone? You know, and so on and so on. So if everybody in this room was doing that, all that stuff, which we would need 3 or 4 days to talk more about and practice, it might make a difference. But I think your question is, how do we infect that into the system of governance and decision making so that that becomes the norm rather than the exception? And that's a huge one, eh?
Yeah.
How do you institutionalize that when our behavior is different? A number of people said my knee-jerk response is. Let's ask the other people who had their hands up and then back to you. Was it? Yep.
I think
Sorry,
a couple of
no,
things are really important. First of all, recognize that public meetings, otherwise known as the last of the blood sports, are usually an abysmal failure.
Yeah.
When you walk into any contentious public meeting, you walk in and people seat themselves, position themselves by their seating.
Sure.
So they are listening, they are positioned before they're ever going to interest.
By constituency.
Exactly. The other thing that I have certainly observed is that I don't care where the community is. Like I come from southeastern Alberta, you know, where one of the worst things you could do is vote Liberal. But there's something that you could do worse than that, and whether you're a Hutterite or whether you're a Liberal, the one thing that you do not bloody well do is leave somebody stuck. Whether it's a Liberal, whether it's a Hutterite, you get them out. If you don't help them out, get them out of the trouble they're in, your name is forever blood in that community. Salt Spring isn't much different.
Stuck in the snow, stuck in the mud.
Yeah.
I thought the worst thing they could do would be vote NDP.
NDP is for
Okay. And I mean, I've watched career adversaries on Salt Spring through the sewer debate, for instance, be very helpful to one another and be very jovial with each other in real life. It's weird, in the same service clubs and stuff. How about there? And Kathy?
One thing I would say is that for us to acknowledge that our thoughts change.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we go in and it sounds like we're so positional, and if we could treat our thoughts lightly, because they do change. I mean, if we were adversarial and all of a sudden something dropped on us, or some catastrophe happened, our thinking changes. So the opportunity is always that thinking can change. And to answer your question, probably 25, 30 years ago, one way to initiate change on the island and to have more people understand about restorative practice is, Gordon said to me, I was one of 2 women at a training we did for United Church Ministers up on the hill about 25 years ago. And you said, I think you should be a mediator. And I laughed. I have 3 kids and I couldn't go to law school. And you advised me to go and do some practicing at the JI. And I have, and thousands of people have learned about mediation only because of you. So
It was my fault. That's lovely, I don't remember that. Hand? Was a hand? Yes.
Yeah. There's an interesting aspect to all of this, because I think the dynamics of all these discussions and how you have that discussion really changes on the size of the group that you're having that discussion in.
Yeah.
And I know when you look at, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, when it's negotiations, which I've done a lot of, where it is positional, and depending on the form, whether it's an international treaty or whatever, the positions are taken quite clearly. When you get into trying to bring in values in those forums, it becomes quite difficult in many cases, but there's always value in doing that. When you start adding cultural or economic negotiations, then there's a different set of values and ability to talk about those values. When you move into cultural negotiations or cultural discussions where you're trying to resolve disputes, or hopefully not even make it a dispute, but resolve differences, identifying values and identity becomes such a key factor before you can even engage in the discussion. And the size of the group doesn't seem to matter. And it seems like in our culture, we have a reluctance to actually talking about values because it's personal. We're willing to attack each other personally, but we're not willing to talk about what we personally value. And it becomes very difficult then to actually move across that line that you had and actually go below what looks like is below the belt. And in many people's is probably considered a below the belt discussion. So bringing that in, and I mean, I've sat through, a forum of 500 First Nations representatives where that part of the discussion had to be resolved before any of the needs and desires could be moved on to. And there was this ongoing process of the other person has to respond and clearly identify that, not just do they have to clearly identify and say back what you said to them, you actually have to acknowledge that you feel the other person has acknowledged and understood, not agreed with. And the term agree to disagree is an interesting term, because a lot of people go, what does agree to disagree mean, and how does that fit into this? And I think it is actually that dotted line. We agree that we disagree. We have differences. But we can actually then, and you talk about how in some negotiations with the state government and First Nations, the values are so intrinsically different. But you can move on to those other things because that step has actually been taken.
As long as they can translate difference into specific disagreements, then they can get their teeth in.
And like the comment was by Ted Hughes, that you feel like you've been heard. Then you can start talking about needs, desires, and other things. Now the interesting thing of bringing this back onto Salt Spring is, where do we have that discussion? And that to me is sort of a big core of why these things are played out in the press or petitions.
Because there isn't an obvious procedural methodology that isn't the middle school gym, those awful bear pity things.
So we immediately go to the positional with never ever crossing that line into that other value. And in a lot of cases, with a lot of organizations that are represented on the island, I am not a big advocate, I never have been, of incorporation, but at least in incorporation, you have a forum for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
By having so many of our services provided by unelected volunteers, who then have this added sense of responsibility that they're supposed to be accountable back to the public without ever having a forum or the ability to cross that process line.
There isn't clarity about that process.
In this intangible.
Anywhere.
Again, there's this intangible position that everyone's in that you can't really do what is expected of you. So therefore, is this going to be played out in the newspaper, in letters to the editor? So
It always was.
It
It's
always
been
was,
that way.
but you'd think that after all these years, we're supposed to learn something.
One would have thought.
But we just constantly repeat this pattern. And we're
Our
supposed to
kids
be
won't
this
do it, though. Our
enlightened
kids won't do it.
community, and yet we don't seem to want to take on the challenge. And so I think, a lot of people came out here tonight, even though there's supposed to be a hurricane force wind and torrential rain, because I think there is a desire to cross that line and find that. And I think we're not going to do that here tonight. So it's almost like, okay, we've taken a first step, but where's the second step going?
And that's going to be a question for others. Thank goodness I heard it. But your question or comment was?
Oh, I'm not a mediator or
Did it get
anything like
lost?
that, but I just have to say that I think groups of people who have got big issues and they clump together in a room, they're totally threatened. So by diffusing them and understanding them and simply getting to the level where you can talk, allows everybody to leave that meeting. Maybe nothing's done, but at least there's community.
Chance to express themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a real insistence on Salt Spring, always has been, that people should have an individual chance to express themselves. It's not libertarianism. What is that? But I noticed that within months of moving here, years and years ago, where people move here in reaction to something with dreams and expectations, and it's a strong-willed place. And I love that passion myself. But to find ways to do that more civilly is the key. One last comment, then we're going to go on, I think.
I'd just like to just acknowledge the fact that everybody in this room is here with a shared value.
Yes.
That we all love this place, this island, this beautiful place. And we really, really value this community and sense of community, and everybody here in this room is committed towards a better community.
That's great.
Somehow. And, we're struggling with these issues.
Well, maybe
that shared value that we all have here, I think, needs to be acknowledged.
Well, maybe part of the way ahead then is for the Salt Spring Restorative Justices and the Islands Trusts and the advisory groups of one kind or another, whether they have that legislative authority or whether they're just self-declared, to work on that, to talk about what should our processes be like, to more fully realize input, because that's important, but also then to accomplish some of these other things rather than solidifying our positions against each other. And something I said earlier, the value of constituency when you find yourself in one, and you probably are a lot, doing the navel-gazing about this, and I say that with respect. I mean, we should be looking at what is it that is fundamental to us. It's almost like strategic paths for those who worked on that. So, what's the vision? What's our expectation? Constituency. Anybody who's for or against anything should be able to put their finger on what fuels them. Right? I think I'm done, and I don't want to.
Gordon, I just wanted to share something that a friend of mine, a French Canadian, who was working with a school district where there are a lot of issues with parents, with students, with school board, with teachers. And so what he did, and I thought it was ingenious, it kind of fits with what you're talking about, is everybody had a piece of chalk. And they went around and they wrote down the things that they thought were important. But if you saw somebody else's thing that you didn't think was important, you could rub it off. And in the end, they were left with some things which everybody basically agreed were shared values or whatever you want. Then the next step was, all right, let's examine our practices now and see if they actually match up with the things that we have left on the board. And this is quite exciting to see it because it is a form of solution.
Yeah, it is interesting. Good stuff. Marla. She always gets the last word in our family.
I just wanted to say that on that table, after living with Gord for 40 years and being around this and seeing the power of the process of mediation and being fully convinced, my sister and I worked on a box to put a mediator in the box. And so we did. It's the process of mediation in the box, and it has, its value is that it helps to build skills. And it also gives you opportunities to practice with the people in your immediate family or someone close to you, a neighbor. It gives you a chance to practice and develop these things, which then hopefully might ripple out into the world. So what I'd like to do is, if any of you are interested in a box, I'm happy to give you one. So if you want to just put your name on a list over there, I'll just leave a piece of paper. Put your name on a list. I will bring those boxes over to West of the Moon, and you can just pick them up free. And then after you guys, they are available at West of the Moon for $38. So, so that's just something I'd like to throw out there. As,
I thought it was going to be shameless self-promotion, and here you're giving Why did you say that? What's good? It's good.
I just want to make one suggestion because it just came out. What can we do? When there's a public meeting, any number of the people in this room can go to that public meeting, and when they stand up to speak and it's really heated, use those suggestions. Say, hey, can we come to an understanding about this? What are you feeling about this? Ask those constituencies. We can do that much, each of us, right? That's one way we can start.
Gordon, I'd like to have the last word.
Yes.
I'd like to thank you very much for it. Thank you. Of the series because I think people are really enjoying this, and I think we're getting a lot out of it. I learned earlier today that you didn't want any ball caps or mugs.
Mugs, yeah.
Despite the fact that I think Judy would have liked me to get rid of a few mugs. I think we like at home. So we have in this little envelope something that you probably will enjoy.
Oh, lovely.
It's not a mug or a ball cap.
No, notice.
I'll give it to you once we get rid of some of these chairs.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you all. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you.